Our family cabin sat on the edge of a frozen lake, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was tradition, 1 week every winter, just me, my wife, and our son. No phones, no distractions, just us and the silence of the woods. The first few days were peaceful. We chopped wood, played board games, and drank hot cocoa by the fire. At night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, but inside, wrapped in blankets, we were safe. Or so I thought. On the 4th night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I wasn't sure why. The cabin was dark, the fire in the hearth reduced to soft embers. My wife slept soundly beside me, and down the hall, our son's door was shut. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not inside the cabin. On the ice. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching over the frozen lake. I sat up, my pulse quickening. My breath fogged in the cold air as I leaned toward the window, wiping away the frost with my sleeve. A figure stood in the middle of the lake. It wore no coat, no shoes. Just a thin, tattered shirt that clung to its body. Its skin looked pale under the moonlight, almost blue. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze locked onto the cabin. A chill ran down my spine. I nudged my wife. "Maggie," I whispered. "Someone's out there." She groaned, barely opening her eyes. "Honey, go back to sleep." I turned back to the window. The figure was closer. It hadn't moved. Or at least I hadn't seen it move. But now it was standing at the edge of the lake, near the dock. My stomach twisted. Then the footsteps started again. But they weren't on the ice anymore. They were on the porch. My breath hitched as soft tapping came from the window above our bed. But our bedroom was on the 2nd floor. I didn't want to look. But I had to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass. A face grinned back at me. It was mine. Its lips stretched too wide, teeth too sharp. Its eyes were hollow, black pits. The breath in my lungs turned to ice. I couldn't move. Couldn't blink. Then the grin widened. It raised a hand and pressed it against the glass. The window pane froze over. The room went black. The next morning, Maggie found me outside, barefoot on the ice. She screamed, running toward me, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "Oh my God! What the hell were you doing out here?" I shivered violently, my feet raw and blue. I didn't remember stepping outside. I didn't remember opening the door. But I must have, right? Maggie swore I was still sleeping beside her when she woke up. But that was impossible. My son stood on the porch, clutching his stuffed bear, his face pale with fear. "Daddy," he whispered, "why were you knocking on my window last night?" My mouth went dry. I turned slowly, looking back at the frozen lake. Faint footprints led from the ice to the cabin. But there were 2 sets. One leading toward the house, and one leading back to the lake. It was supposed to be a simple drive home. I'd done this route 100 times before, through long stretches of empty road, the kind where you could go 20 miles without seeing another set of headlights. It was past midnight, and the snow had started falling lightly when I left my brother's place. I figured I'd be home in an hour, 2 at the most. Then the blizzard came. Thick snow swallowed the road like a hungry beast, turning everything into a swirling, blinding mess of white. My high beams barely cut through it. My wipers fought desperately against the ice forming on the windshield. The radio sputtered, then died, leaving me alone with the sound of my own breathing and the rhythmic thump of the tires against the frozen pavement. I was alone, or so I thought. Then I saw him, a man standing in the middle of the road. I barely had time to react. My heart leapt into my throat as I slammed the brakes, my tires skidding on the ice before the car lurched to a stop. My hands clenched the wheel. The man stood motionless in my headlights, dressed in nothing but a tattered coat. Snow clung to his thin frame, his bare feet lost in the drifts. His face was pale. His eyes were dark pits. I swallowed hard, forcing my shaking hands to roll down the window just a crack. "Do you need help?" I called out. The man took a step forward. A gust of wind slammed against my car, and the interior lights flickered. My breath fogged the windshield as the temperature inside dropped suddenly sharply. The engine sputtered, then coughed and died. The man took another step. My fingers trembled as I reached for my phone. No signal. The screen was black, like the battery had been drained. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. There were no footprints in the snow behind him. I locked the doors. The man smiled. His lips pulled back too far, revealing teeth too sharp, too long. He lifted a hand, pressed it to the glass. His skin was bluish-gray, his nails blackened and cracked. When he spoke, his voice was inside my head, a whisper against my skull. "You brought me back." A sharp knock sounded from the back seat. I turned. The world went black. I don't remember how long I was unconscious. When I opened my eyes, I was outside, lying in the snow. My car was still there, but the driver's door was wide open, the engine running again, exhaust curling up into the freezing air. My body felt wrong, numb, disconnected. My head pounded, and my arms and legs wouldn't move at first, as if I'd been lying in the cold for hours. Slowly, I forced myself up. The wind howled around me, but the road was empty. The man was gone. Shivering violently, I stumbled toward my car. My breath hitched as I grabbed the door handle. It was warm. Too warm, like the engine had been running for hours. My seat was dry, but I wasn't. My clothes were soaked, my hair damp with melted snow. My hands left wet smears on the leather steering wheel as I collapsed into the seat, gasping. And then I noticed it. The footprints. A trail of wet, slushy footprints led from the back seat to the driver's side. My stomach twisted as I slowly turned my head. The rearview mirror was fogged over. But through the haze, I could just barely see a shape sitting in the back seat. I held my breath. A handprint appeared in the condensation. Then another. Then a face. A grin spread across the glass, teeth stretching too wide. I slammed my foot on the gas. The tires spun wildly before catching, and I tore down the road, heart hammering. My hands were slick on the wheel. The snow swirled around me, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. The mirror stayed fogged. But the knocking on the backseat window didn't stop. Not for miles. I made it home somehow. Parked crooked in my driveway and ran inside, bolting the door behind me. I don't remember much of what happened after that. Just flashes. The heat blasting from the vents as I shivered violently on the floor. My wife shaking me awake, her face pale with worry. I told her everything. She thought I was in shock, maybe hypothermic. Maybe I was. But later that night, I checked my car. The back seat was dry. Empty. But the inside of the rear window was still fogged over. And scrawled into the mist, written in long, thin letters, was a message. "You brought me back." I've been driving trucks for nearly 20 years. I've seen a lot on these highways. Wrecks, weirdos, even the occasional hitchhiker standing in places no sane person should be. But nothing, not in all my years, prepared me for what I saw that night. It was late January, deep into a brutal winter. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones, makes your breath hang in the air like smoke. I was hauling freight through North Dakota, where the roads stretch endlessly into nothingness, flanked by snow-covered fields that go on forever. No cars. No towns. Just me and the dark. I had the radio on low, an old country song crackling through the static. My headlights cut through the falling snow, the high beams struggling against the swirling whiteout. I was tired, but I'd done this route before. One more hour and I'd pull into a rest stop, get some coffee, maybe stretch my legs. Then I saw them. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Shapes in the snow, just beyond the shoulder of the road. People. They stood perfectly still, barely visible through the flurries. No coats. No hats. Just thin clothing that clung to their frozen bodies. Their faces were turned toward me, but they didn't move. Didn't wave for help. Didn't react to the roaring engine of my truck. I slowed down, my fingers tightening on the wheel. What the hell were they doing out here? As I passed, my headlights illuminated them for just a second. Their skin was white with frost, their hair stiff with ice. Their eyes hollow, empty sockets. Their mouths gaped open, frozen mid-scream. A chill ran down my spine. I pressed my foot on the gas. The truck rumbled forward, tires crunching over packed snow. My heart pounded. I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to breathe. Just keep driving. Keep your eyes on the road. Then a few miles later, I saw more of them. Hundreds. Lining both sides of the highway. Staring. Their bodies were half buried in the snowdrifts, their arms at their sides. Some stood right at the edge of the road, so close I thought I might clip them with my mirrors. They didn't move. Didn't blink. Just watched. I wanted to look away. I should have looked away. But my eyes locked on them as I drove past, my stomach twisting into knots. Their mouths were all open, some wider than humanly possible, as if they were still screaming, but no sound came out. Then my radio crackled. A voice. A whisper. "Why did you leave us?" My breath hitched. I snatched the CB radio off the dash. "Hello? Who's there?" Nothing but static. I checked my mirrors. They were closer. The frozen ones no longer lined the road. They were on it, standing in the middle of the highway, their heads snapping toward me as I sped away. Then I saw it. A figure in the back of my truck. The trailer door should have been locked. No way in or out. But there it was, a shape barely visible through the frost-covered glass of the rearview mirror. I couldn't breathe. My foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor. The truck roared, tires skidding slightly as I pushed it harder than I should have. The shape in the mirror didn't move, but I could feel it watching me. Then the temperature inside the cab dropped. I could see my breath. The windshield froze over from the inside. The voice returned, clearer this time. "You left us to die." My hands were numb. My vision blurred. My bones ached with the deep, relentless cold. The truck shuddered violently. The steering wheel jerked in my hands. Then just ahead I saw lights. "Arrest stop." I swerved into the lot, my tires skidding as I yanked the wheel, pulling into an empty space. The moment I stopped, I threw open the door and jumped out, nearly slipping on the ice. The night was still. The wind had died. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky. I turned back to my truck. The trailer doors were wide open. My stomach twisted. I knew I hadn't opened them. Slowly, I walked to the back of the truck. My boots crunched in the snow. My breath came in quick, shaky puffs. The cargo was still there. Pallets of supplies stacked neatly. Nothing had been touched, except for the floor. There, in the thin layer of frost covering the metal surface, were footprints. Bare. Human. They led from the back of the trailer to the driver's seat. I felt something behind me. A breath on my neck. I turned. Nothing. The highway was empty. But in the distance, beyond the trees, I thought I saw them. A line of frozen figures. Watching. Waiting. I didn't sleep that night. I locked the truck, turned the heat up as high as it would go, and gripped the steering wheel until my fingers ached. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. The footprints were gone. The trailer doors were shut. Maybe it was a dream. Maybe I had imagined it. But as I climbed back into the cab, my breath caught in my throat. The windshield was still frosted over from the inside. And written in the ice in long, jagged letters was a single word. Liar. It was Christmas Eve, and I was driving through an unfamiliar neighborhood. Snow piled high outside, blanketing the streets and trees in thick layers of white, and I struggled to see through the drifting flakes. I was on my way to my cousin's place, relying on a text from Mark for directions, but my GPS had glitched, leaving me to navigate by memory and fading street signs. After a long search through winding roads and silent suburbs, I finally found a house that matched the address. A welcoming two-story home with warm light spilling from its windows, a festive wreath on the door, and an inviting air that felt almost too perfect for such a bitter night. I parked my car in the snow-covered driveway and stepped out, my boots crunching on the frozen ground. The cold bit at my skin as I approached the door and knocked. The sound echoed in the stillness before the door creaked open on its own. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the gentle glow of a crackling fireplace. Stockings hung neatly from the mantel, and the subtle aroma of cinnamon and pine mingled with the scent of burning wood, making everything seem comforting and familiar. "Hello," I called softly, expecting a cheerful greeting. But there was no answer. My eyes drifted to the family photo on the mantel, and a knot tightened in my stomach when I realized that the smiling faces were not those of my cousin's family. Instead, they were strangers with eyes that seemed to watch me, filled with a sorrow I couldn't place. Before I could gather my thoughts, a sudden thump from upstairs made my heart race. I turned toward the staircase, my pulse quickening. I stepped back toward the door, but in an instant, it slammed shut with a resounding bang, plunging the room into heavy silence. Heavy footsteps soon echoed from above, slow, deliberate steps that sent chills down my spine. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call out or signal for help, but there was no signal in this isolated place. The footsteps grew louder until they reached the hallway outside. Then, emerging from the shadows, a woman appeared. She was dressed in a simple nightgown, her hair unkempt, and her face twisted in a mix of rage and despair. "You're not supposed to be here," she hissed, her voice resonating with a cold finality. In that moment, the lights began to flicker, and the room's comforting warmth dissolved into something sinister. Before my eyes, the walls started to decay. The cheerful paint bubbled and peeled away to reveal dark, rotting wood. The furniture crumbled into dust, and the lively fireplace turned into a cold, empty hole that swallowed all hope. I stood frozen in horror as the room transformed into a macabre scene of decay and neglect. Then I felt it, a presence behind me. I slowly turned, terror gripping every muscle, and there she was, standing right behind me. Her eyes were dark voids, her face a mask of malice and grief, and I couldn't move or cry out. The realization hit me hard. I had entered the wrong house, a place haunted by secrets and memories that should have remained undisturbed. I must have done something to awaken what lay hidden here. As I backed away, my mind raced through every ghost story I'd ever heard, every whispered legend of restless spirits and cursed abodes. The decorations and warm lights were a cruel facade concealing a darkness far more ancient and vengeful than I could imagine. Desperate to escape, I stumbled toward a side door, its old wood groaning under my weight as I forced it open. I slipped into a narrow hallway shrouded in deep shadows, each step echoing with my mounting dread. Behind me, the woman's voice continued to whisper, "You're not supposed to be here," over and over, as if sealing my fate. Outside, the bitter cold hit me like a slap, and I ran into the night without daring to look back. The snow fell silently, almost as if trying to smother the horror of that place, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was watching me, its broken windows like eyes that would never forget my intrusion. I finally reached my car and slammed the door behind me, my hands trembling so violently I could barely start the engine. As I drove away, the twisted image of that decaying house and the woman's accusing gaze haunted me. Even now, in the safety of my own home, every creak and shadow reminds me of that night. I wonder if the wrong house still stands somewhere, waiting for its next unwary visitor, its secrets forever buried in decay and sorrow. I was 10 the first time I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from inside the chimney. It was late December, and outside, snow piled high against the windows. Our house, an old, creaky thing built long before I was born, felt even colder in winter. "Just squirrels," Dad said when I mentioned it. "They get in sometimes. Don't worry." So I tried not to. But on Christmas Eve, the sound changed. It wasn't just scratching anymore. It was breathing. Slow. Heavy. Deep. I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my tiny fingers clenching the edge of my blanket. At first, I thought it was the wind howling through the chimney, but no, it had a rhythm, like something was alive in there. Something waiting. I squeezed my eyes shut. Maybe if I ignored it, it would go away. Then it whispered my name. "Alex." My whole body stiffened. The whisper was low and raspy, like dry leaves rustling against the stone walls of the chimney. It came from the fireplace, just across the room from my bed. I pulled the covers over my head, my breath coming in short gasps. "Alex." It was closer now. The fireplace groaned, the old bricks shifting slightly as if something was pressing against them. I peeked out from under the blankets, my heart hammering. Then I saw it. A single blackened hand reached out from the chimney, its fingers too long, the skin cracked and charred like burnt wood. The fingernails were jagged, broken things black as soot. I wanted to scream, but my throat closed up, the terror stealing my voice. The hand twitched, the fingers curling like it was testing the air. Then it turned slowly, deliberately toward me. A shriek tore from my throat, my body jerking back so hard I nearly fell off the bed. The bedroom door burst open. Dad stood in the doorway, his face alarmed. "What's wrong?" I pointed at the fireplace, shaking, my words lost in terrified sobs. He turned on the lights. The room was exactly as it had been before. The fireplace was empty, just cold bricks and ashes. Dad knelt beside me, smoothing my hair. "It was just a bad dream, buddy. It's okay." But I knew what I saw. That thing in the chimney. It wasn't a dream. I grew up. We moved out of that house when I was 16, and life went on. Years passed, the memory of that night buried under adulthood, work, responsibilities. Then last Christmas, I went back. I don't know why. Maybe nostalgia. Maybe unfinished business. The old house stood just as it always had. Tired, weathered, but still there. Snow covered the roof, the yard untouched by footprints. The new owners had abandoned it long ago. I walked up to the front door, brushing snow off my coat. The windows were dark, the air still. And then, just as I stepped past the chimney, I heard it. A whisper. Alex. The same rasping, hollow voice from all those years ago. The blood in my veins turned to ice. I backed away, my breath clouding in the frozen air. The chimney loomed beside me, old bricks crumbling at the edges. Something moved inside. Not a squirrel. Not the wind. Something else. I turned and ran, not stopping until I was back in my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For just a second, I swore I saw something standing on the roof. Something blackened and burnt, its fingers curling like it was testing the air. It still knew my name. Winter came early that year, painting our little town in thick white snow before Thanksgiving. It was the kind of snow that swallowed sound, that made the world feel softer, quieter. I didn't mind it. Lily, my 6-year-old daughter, loved it. She had been begging me for weeks to help her build a snowman. "Please, Daddy," she'd say, bouncing on her toes. "Just one. A big one." That Sunday after breakfast, we bundled up and went outside. She worked with excitement, packing the snow into uneven spheres, her tiny hands fumbling with the shape. I helped roll the biggest mound for the base, but after that, she refused my help. "This one is mine," she insisted. She gave it a carrot for a nose, 2 stick arms, and wrapped one of her old scarves around its neck. But when it came time to make the eyes, she hesitated. "I'll be right back," she chirped, running toward the tree line behind our house. I frowned, watching her go. "Lily, where are you?" "Just a second," she called back. I sighed and let her go. The woods weren't deep, and there was nothing dangerous out there. At least, nothing I thought could hurt her. A few minutes later, she returned, her little mittened hands curled around 2 small black stones. "These are perfect," she said, breathless. I didn't know why, but the moment she pressed them into the snowman's face, I felt uneasy. The stones weren't like normal river rocks. They were too smooth, too polished. And they seemed to drink the light, like tiny black holes. "He's done," Lily beamed. "Isn't he great?" I forced a smile. "Yeah, sweetheart. He's great." That night, as the wind howled through the trees, I made the mistake of looking outside. The snowman stood where we had left it. At least, I thought it did. Something was different. Maybe it was the angle of its head, tilted slightly downward, as if watching the house. Maybe it was just my imagination. Or maybe it was the eyes. They looked darker now. Deeper. I told myself it was nothing. Just shadows. Just the tricks of a tired mind. But by morning, I wasn't so sure. The snowman had moved. It was closer. Now, instead of standing by the tree line, it was a good 5 feet nearer to the porch. I stared at it from the front window, my coffee growing cold in my hands. My gut twisted with something I couldn't explain. "Lily," I called. "Did you move the snowman?" She glanced up from her cereal, spoon halfway to her mouth. "No. You sure?" She nodded. "He likes to watch us." The way she said it, casual matter of fact, sent a cold shiver through me. That afternoon, while Lily was inside watching cartoons, I grabbed a shovel and went outside. The closer I got to the snowman, the more I felt wrong. Like standing too close to a ledge, or near an open grave. I knocked it down. Then I kicked apart the remains, scattering the pieces with my boots. The black stones, however, didn't sink into the snow like I expected. They sat there, untouched, like they didn't belong. I stared at them for a long moment before finally picking them up and tossing them into the woods. That night, something woke me. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving across the frozen yard. I swallowed hard, heart hammering. I told myself it was just the wind, just a stray animal. But I knew better. I reached for the curtain. Hesitated. Then slowly I pulled it back. The snowman was back. Only it wasn't the same. It was taller now. Thinner. Its limbs were too long, its stick arms bent at odd angles. The scarf Lily had wrapped around its neck was gone. And its head. It twitched. A quick, jerky motion like it was looking right at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My breath came in ragged gasps. This wasn't possible. I ran to Lily's room, scooped her up, and carried her to the car. She stirred, mumbling sleepily, but didn't wake. I didn't care. I started the engine and drove. We checked into a motel a few miles away. I didn't sleep. By morning, the fear had settled into something cold and heavy in my chest. I had to go back. I had to know. Lily and I returned home just after sunrise. The driveway was still empty, the snow in the yard untouched. For a brief moment, I thought maybe I had imagined it all. Then I stepped inside and saw it. The snowman was in the living room. It stood in the middle of the floor, melting, water pooling around its base. Its long, jagged arms stretched outward. And the black stones? They were gone. I turned, panic seizing my chest. Lily, go back to the car. But she wasn't behind me anymore. She was standing in the doorway. Her little feet were bare, her breath misting in the cold air. And her eyes were black. 2 pits of endless darkness. She smiled. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice not quite her own. "He likes to watch us." Driving Uber at night in a snowstorm wasn't the best idea, but I needed the money. Bills were piling up, and the holiday season had drained my bank account. So, I ignored the weather warnings, filled up my tank, and hit the road. By 2 a.m., the streets were nearly deserted. The snowfall had thickened, swirling in my headlights like restless ghosts. My last few rides had been quick, drunk college kids, a tired nurse, a guy who smelled like cigarettes and regret. Then I got a request. The pickup location was near an old intersection on the outskirts of town. I almost ignored it. The area was nothing but abandoned buildings and an overgrown cemetery. But surge pricing had kicked in, and I wasn't about to turn down a high-paying ride. I pulled up to the corner, wipers struggling against the heavy snow. A woman stood under a dim streetlight. She wore an old-fashioned gray coat, buttoned all the way up to her chin, with a dark scarf wrapped tightly around her head. Her hands were clasped in front of her, unmoving, as if she'd been standing there for hours. I rolled down the window slightly. "You call for a ride?" She nodded. Something about her made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way she didn't seem cold despite the freezing wind. Maybe it was the way she moved, slow, deliberate, like she was thinking about every step. The back door creaked open, and she slid into the seat behind me. The moment she shut the door, the temperature inside my car plunged. I shivered and cranked up the heat. My breath fogged in front of me. The scent of damp earth filled the car, like old leaves and wet stone. She didn't say a word, just stared out the window. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Her skin was pale, too pale. Her lips almost colorless. I cleared my throat. "Rough night." She slowly turned her head. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like her body wasn't used to bending that way. "I've been waiting a long time," she whispered. A chill crawled up my spine. "For what?" She smiled. "It was wrong. Too wide. Too many teeth. For someone to take me home." My stomach twisted. I forced a chuckle, trying to shake off the unease. "Well, that's what I'm here for." I glanced at my phone for the destination, but my GPS was glitching. The route kept rerouting over and over, the screen flickering like it was struggling to lock onto a location. "Where's home?" I asked. She lifted a single, trembling hand and pointed ahead. I followed her finger. The road stretched forward, disappearing into the heavy snowfall. No streetlights, no houses. Just miles of snow-covered woods. I swallowed hard. "Miss, I think we're going the wrong way." No response. I flicked a glance at the rearview mirror. She wasn't there. The seat was empty. The door had never opened. The locks were still engaged. But the seatbelt was still buckled. My hands clenched the steering wheel, knuckles white. I imagined it. Just my mind playing tricks. I reached for my phone to cancel the ride. Then in the mirror, a face. Her face. Sitting directly behind me. My breath hitched. I slammed the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching against the ice. Silence. I didn't want to turn around. I couldn't turn around. Slowly, I reached for the door handle. "Don't." Her voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a blade. I squeezed my eyes shut. My heartbeat thundered in my ears. "I just want to go home," she murmured. Cold fingers brushed my shoulder. I yanked the door open and tumbled into the snow. The wind howled around me. My car sat idling, driver's door swinging in the wind. I forced myself to look. The back seat was empty, but the passenger door was open, snow piling onto the seat. And in the distance, just beyond the tree line, a figure in a gray coat, walking into the woods. She never looked back. The next morning, I checked my ride history. There was no record of the trip. But when I got back into my car, the seatbelt in the back was still buckled, and the seat was ice cold. The phone rang at midnight. I was already half asleep, tangled in a nest of blankets, the cold creeping through the old walls of my apartment. The blizzard outside had been raging for hours, wind howling like something alive. The heater struggled, but it was losing the fight. The screen glowed in the darkness. Unknown caller. I frowned. Who the hell was calling at this hour? I hesitated but swiped to answer. Hello. For a moment, silence. Then static, soft at first, then louder, like an old television caught between channels. Then, come outside. The voice was a whisper. Soft. Familiar. A shiver crawled up my spine. I pulled the phone away, squinting at the caller ID. My stomach dropped. The number on the screen. It was mine. My own phone number. I sat up, the drowsiness vanishing in an instant. A prank. A glitch. Maybe someone had spoofed my number. I hung up. The wind outside wailed, rattling the windows. I pulled the covers tighter around me, my heart beating a little too fast. Probably some hacker messing around. Then my phone rang again. Same number. Same whisper. I'm waiting. A cold weight settled in my chest. I forced a laugh, though my throat was dry. Okay, real funny. Who is this? Silence. Then a slow, static-laced breath. Look outside. My hands clenched around the phone. The air in my room suddenly felt too thick, too heavy. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window. Snow blanketed the yard. The street lamp flickered, casting weak, yellow light over the drifts. No footprints. No movement. Nothing. I exhaled, relieved. It was just some weirdo messing with me. Then my phone buzzed. A message. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the screen before I tapped it open. It was a picture. Of my front yard. The snow. The street lamp. The window. But in the photo, someone was standing there. A figure, half hidden in the shadows, just outside the window. Watching me. I scrambled out of bed, my breath coming in short gasps. My hands were shaking as I reached for the curtain. I didn't want to look. But I had to. I peeked outside. Nothing. Just snow. My phone buzzed again. Another picture. I was in this one. Standing outside. Barefoot in the snow, arms hanging limp at my sides. Face pale. Eyes staring straight into the camera. A horrible, twisted smile on my lips. My breath hitched. My pulse pounded in my ears. I wasn't outside. I was here, in my room, staring at my phone with shaking hands. Then something tapped on the window. A single, gentle tap, tap, tap. I turned. And there I was. Standing outside. Pale. Smiling. Watching myself from the other side of the glass. My lips moved, though I couldn't hear the words. Then my phone rang again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The thing outside didn't move, didn't blink. It just kept grinning, steam curling from its mouth into the frozen air. Then, my bedroom door creaked open. I spun, heart hammering. The hallway was dark. My breath fogged in the sudden chill. I wasn't alone. A shape moved in the shadows. The phone slipped from my hands as I backed up against the wall, my gaze darting between the doorway and the window. The figure outside was gone. But I felt it. Behind me. The air grew colder. My breath came in short gasps, visible in the dim light. Then, a whisper, right against my ear. Let me in. I lunged for the lamp and flicked it on. Light flooded the room. Empty. The hallway. The window. The reflection. All normal. No sign of whatever that thing was. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands. The last message was still open. But the picture had changed. It was no longer of my front yard. It was my room. A photo taken from behind me. The timestamp? 1 second ago. I ran. Ice fishing had always been my escape. There was something about the silence of the frozen lake, the way the world seemed to pause, that made me feel at peace. Out there, it was just me, the cold, and the slow, steady waiting for a bite. No ringing phones, no demands, just stillness. That winter had been brutal. The lake froze solid faster than usual, the ice thick and blue, promising a long season. It was mid-December when I decided to head out for the first time, right before sunset. The air was sharp, biting at my exposed skin as I hauled my sled across the ice. I had my usual setup: drill, fishing rod, small folding chair, and a lantern to keep me company when the night settled in. I picked my usual spot, about 100 yards from shore. I liked it there, deep water, good fish. I drilled a hole, watching the shavings of ice scatter across the surface like glass shards. Then I set up my lantern, adjusted my gloves, and dropped my line. For the first hour, it was perfect. The sky darkened to a deep navy, stars beginning to shimmer above. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, catching in my eyelashes. I took slow, even breaths, enjoying the solitude. Then I heard it. A knock. Soft, hollow. Faint enough that I might have imagined it. I glanced around. The ice stretched out in every direction, empty except for me. The wind had died down. No trees. No wildlife. Just silence. Then it came again. Knock. 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 I sat up straight. It hadn't come from around me. It had come from beneath me. I swallowed, forcing myself to stay calm. Ice makes noise sometimes, shifting as it adjusts to the cold. That's all it was. That's all it had to be. But then I saw it. A handprint. Pressed against the ice about 5 feet away. I went completely still, my breath hitching in my throat. The print was black, darker than the ice, like something had burned the shape of a palm and fingers onto the surface. But it wasn't still. The fingers were twitching. A slow, dragging motion, nails scraping lightly against the frozen surface. My stomach clenched. My body screamed at me to move, to run, but I was frozen in place. Then the knocking started again. Louder. Faster. Desperate. I scrambled backward, kicking up snow as I fumbled to stand. My fishing rod clattered to the ice. That's when I saw the face, just beneath the surface. Mouth wide open as if screaming, but no sound came. Eyes vacant, but moving, darting back and forth. The knocking turned into pounding. Hard, forceful. Let me out. The words slammed into my brain like a whisper I wasn't supposed to hear. I spun on my heels and ran. I didn't stop. Not when my lantern tipped over, sending shadows leaping. Not when my sled nearly tipped in my rush to reach the shore. My boots slid across the ice, but I didn't fall. I couldn't. I had to get away. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely shove the key into the ignition. The headlights illuminated the lake, casting long beams over the untouched snow. Except it wasn't untouched. There, right at the edge of my fishing hole, stood a single dark figure. It wasn't moving. I didn't stay to see if it would. I tore out of there, tires skidding on the frozen road, heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that face, those lifeless eyes watching me from beneath the ice. I told myself I had imagined it. That exhaustion and the cold had played tricks on me. The next morning, I forced myself to go back. The lake was empty. My fishing gear still lay where I had abandoned it. My footprints were still there, leading back to my truck. But the hole in the ice, it was gone. Not frozen over. Not covered with snow. Just gone. Like it had never been there. Like something had sealed it shut. Like something had been trying to come out. Winter was my favorite time of year. Everything felt quiet, like the world had been tucked under a thick, white blanket. Even the woods behind our house, which felt wild and endless in the summer, seemed softer when the snow came. I was 6 years old that winter, and my older brother, Danny, was 10. He was my hero, the one with all the ideas. If Danny said we were going to build a snow fort, then that's what we were going to do. We bundled up in thick coats, hats, and gloves, then trudged deep into the woods, looking for the perfect spot. The air was crisp, and the snow crunched under our boots. Danny picked a clearing, where the trees bent from the weight of ice, their branches hanging low like skeletal fingers. "This is it," he said, already digging into the snow. "This is where we'll make the best fort ever." We spent hours carving out walls, stacking blocks, and smoothing the floor. The deeper we dug, the darker it got inside. It felt strange, how the light outside didn't seem to reach in. But we didn't stop. Then we saw it. At first, I thought it was just a shadow from the trees. A trick of the light. But it didn't move the way shadows should. It stretched unnaturally across the snow, curling like fingers, reaching toward us. Danny frowned. That's weird. He reached out, running a gloved hand over the packed snow, trying to wipe it away. But the shadow didn't go away. I stared at it, my heart pounding. Danny? The fingers twitched. I screamed. Danny jerked back, eyes wide. The shadow shifted, moving against the light, as if it had its own mind. It slithered, its fingers dragging through the snow like claws. We ran. We tore through the trees, tripping, scrambling, not daring to look back. My lungs burned, and my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I saw the porch light of our house. Danny slammed the door behind us, locking it. We stood there, panting, staring at each other. Mom and Dad didn't believe us, of course. Just your imaginations, Dad said, ruffling Danny's hair. Snow does weird things in the light. We didn't argue. We just nodded. But neither of us went back to the fort. That night, something worse happened. I woke up to a strange silence. Not the comforting quiet of winter, but something else. Something hollow. Then I felt the cold. Not normal winter cold, freezing. My breath curled in misty tendrils in the air. My fingers ached as I pulled the blankets tighter around me. Then I saw it. Snow. A thin trail of wet footprints stretched from the back door, through the hallway, and stopped right beside my bed. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. Danny. No. The prints were too small. Then I noticed the shadow, standing in the doorway. Tall. Too tall. Its head nearly touched the ceiling, arms stretched unnaturally long, fingers twitching. It had no eyes, no mouth. Just darkness. A shape cut from the night itself. I couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. Then the whisper came. A voice like wind through dead trees, like cracking ice. I never left. I squeezed my eyes shut, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst. The cold deepened. The bed trembled beneath me. My ears rang with the silence. And then nothing. I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window. The footprints were gone. The room was warm again. Had I dreamed it? Danny and I never spoke about the fort again. We never went back to that part of the woods. But sometimes in winter, when the snow is deep and the night is silent, I still see it. A shadow. Waiting.